Hi, my name is Jessica Thomason. I'm the creator of Connect Beyond the Page. Connect Beyond the Page is a festival and conference that brings people from different backgrounds together to explore how art can influence social change. We'll have filmmakers, journalists, writers, musicians, activists, people from all sorts of different backgrounds coming together to explore how adaptation and collaboration can create a narrative for social change.
Now y'all say that shallow water. Here we go.
All right. Hey, everybody. People are still coming on in here, but we're going to start because it's what we do. And we have a lot to talk about and a lot of things that we're angry about. My name is Joseph Hoodak. I'm senior editor at Rolling Stone. I'm based in Nashville and just came out here to your awesome city yesterday. It's my first time. I love it. I'm definitely going to come back and maybe move. That'll be my second act. So, but I'd like everyone here to introduce themselves, and we're going to talk today about bias and divisiveness in the media and what that entails. I really think it's going to be a fascinating and lively conversation. So let's start with you guys. Start right here from my left.
Hi, I'm Lori Knight. I am a journalist. I worked at CBS News for a long time. I made documentaries there, and for the last 12 years I worked at 60 Minutes working with Mike Wallace, who was one of the founding correspondents, and wound up working with basically everybody except for Leslie Stahl. And I'm sure she's pissed off at me for that.
Hi, my name is JOYCE FERDER. I, for 30 years, covered wars. I worked for CBS, BBC, NBC, ABC, the Dutch, the Danes, Germans, yada, yada, yada. I'm now working on a documentary called Degrees to Extinction, Can We Survive Climate Change? I'm going to Antarctica and Arctica and places in between to see what's going on.
My name is John Marks, and I am a showrunner in documentary television for places like A&E History and Nat Geo, and I'm also an author, former U.S. News and World Report reporter, if anybody remembers that magazine, and a former 60 Minutes producer with Lori over here years ago.
Hello, everyone. My name is Natalie Hopkinson. I am currently a columnist with the Huffington Post. Previously, I also teach in the Communications, Culture, and Media Studies Department at Howard University in Washington, D.C. I write books, and I started my career at the Washington Post. I was an arts and culture writer, and later on I was an editor in the Sunday opinion section of the Post, and also worked as a media and culture critic for theroot.com, which is an online magazine.
So we're in a very interesting time with media today and the way we all receive it, the way we react to it, and the way we make it in that respect. So this first question is going to be a little bit like remember when, but not to date anyone. But what was news media like when you all came up in your respective fields? How did you receive your news?
When I was coming up, and I might be one of the older people here, the whole point of what we did was, it was fact-based. If you were going to give an opinion or analyze anything, it had to be labeled editorial or commentary. You couldn't say what you think. You were taught. I was taught by some of the best people in the world. It doesn't matter what my politics is. It enters into it, not at all. So what you did was you went out, found out what the facts were. You had time to do it. There was no 24-hour monster to feed. You had to do the story and send it back. There were no fax machines. There were no answering machines. There was nothing in those days. So you really had time to learn what the story was and get it right. And then CNN came in. And I'll never forget that, because it was the first time people started standing up there and saying, well, we don't really know what's going on, but here we are. And you're like, well, that's not journalism. And what it's become now, I mean, is so different. But then, all I was ever taught was get the facts. Who, what, where, when, why, and how. And you don't even hear that anymore. And I find that really quite amazing.
I want to jump in and just a little bit, very similar. We're good friends and business partners. But I just want to sort of put something out there that may help a little bit to understand the sea change that we are going through. I'm 57 years old, which means that Walter Cronkite was the person where I got my news whether I wanted to or not. He was my babysitter, essentially, when my parents were, running around the house or doing whatever it is. For some odd reason, I just sat in front of the television whenever Walter Cronkite was on. And I remembered, these Velcro cutouts that were made to look like soldiers fighting in the Vietnam War, and he would name the number of dead. And the nightmares I had as a 4- and 5-year-old listening to this, I still actually remember them. But what underscored all of this was that way back in 1947, I think it was 47, there was something called the Fairness Doctrine that underpinned all broadcast news. You had to do something where you had to give equal time to political candidates, and you also had to spend at least 15 minutes giving local news its due, so that you talked about whatever was going on in literally the backyards of Americans. And for years and years and years, the networks fought against that because they didn't feel that they needed to be regulated. They knew that they were doing due diligence on their own, and for the most part, they pretty much were. Flaws here and there, but not a big deal. And it wasn't until much later during the Reagan administration where there was a real fortified push to get rid of the doctrine, which happens to coincide when Roger Ailes started Fox News, because there was no longer the due diligence to make sure that the audience had both sides of a story in an objective way, and that there was any kind of value to talking about what was actually going on in each and every community. So those are the tenets that we grew up with, and then we were part of that same tradition of being real public servants, essentially. That's what news was supposed to be. Journalism is supposed to be a public service. It's not supposed to be a revenue-generating machine. So just so that you understand a little bit more of the history of it.
I started out in daily newspapers, and what I think most about is the fact that newspapers once mattered. People had sometimes 2 newspapers a day. I grew up in Dallas, Texas. Dallas Morning News, Dallas Times-Herald, 1 in the morning, 1 in the evening. My first job was at the Plano Star-Courier. My second job was at the Iowa City Press-Citizen. I covered school boards, cops and courts. I covered business. I covered religion. And people read that paper. Okay, that was a bedroom community of Dallas, but it was a real thing. Your byline made you answerable to people who knew who you were. When you showed up at the school board as a reporter, they had begun to know who you were. And even if you were writing about something so abstruse and boring that only school board members would care about it, you were expected to get those facts right. And it kind of blows me away. There was a whole system. You could make a living as a journalist. You could start out at a very small paper in the middle of nowhere, work for 2 years. There was a roadmap, work for 2 years, then move maybe to the outer limits of some daily metro, a bigger city, and then you might aspire to the New York Times or the New Yorker if you really had an incredible career. And that's all been decimated. And I think in some ways that the little local small town newspapers, and you could go into any town in this country, it seems like, and go to a gas station and find that paper and know a little bit about what was going on in that town. That is, to me, when I think about what's changed, that's one of the big things. It was like a sifting. It was also people who cared about getting facts straight working at the most local level. So that's kind of amazing.
So I'm 41, so I'm kind of a half, like the internet happened in college for me. And so I sort of know a little bit about being a digital native, but I'm sort of not. I did grow up reading 3 different newspapers my dad subscribed, and I read them. But, one thing, I think is important to remember is that there's always been problems with the media and problems with facts. Facts have always been subjective. There's always been, I mean, if anybody saw Ken Burns' documentary on the Vietnam War, there has been fake news, there has been lies that have been told, the government lies, and often the media uncritically pass on those lies. So the things that we're having now, these aren't necessarily new. There's more awareness about it. So I don't like to romanticize the old days because it definitely kept a lot of people out. We just had a panel earlier today talking about women in media. It kept out women, people of color, voices, things that were important to different communities that outside the power structure. But I am I do. Like when you talk about those boring meetings, I also got a chance to do those boring meetings where you're sort of poring over the campaign finances and, the local media definitely played such an important watchdog role. And so that is a tragedy that's not there, that the economic foundation for newspapers has been decimated, but it was because they were a monopoly, and monopolies are arrogant. So I started feeling like when the internet hit, when I graduated from undergrad in '98, I was really excited because I thought all of the ills, all of the problems with the way that the media is, it would go away with this new thing called the internet. Anybody can pick up the mic and, it's going to be a pure level playing field. Right. And for a while it did seem like it was, but something has gone totally bonkers, to where we can't even have a common conversation about anything because, a lot of the Fox News side, especially, but, you have some of that on the left as well. Everything, they're sort of taking this postmodern idea that, there's no such thing as truth. They've taken it to an extreme to where we can't even have a conversation about what happened yesterday. Right. So we definitely can't have a conversation about what we need to do about the situation if we can't have a common understanding about, whether the sky is blue, anyway, I'll stop there.
You're right on. I think for me, in January after the inauguration, when the phrase alternative facts entered our lexicon, that's when I knew we were in really hot water. Yeah. And that's when I thought that what I do for a living needs to change to a degree in terms of I need to put a little bit more of myself into my writing in terms of what you were saying before, essay/op-ed, editorial. Because I think if you have a voice and someone is coming at you with facts that are not true, you need to go and counter that voice with proper facts. Now that's very hard for all of us here to do because we've kind of been trained to be very objective, and when you can't even agree on what the facts are, how do you even take that first step? But one of y'all used this great phrase. I think it was you, Joyce. It was opinion-based entertainment. Yes. That's really what the news has become today. So how do all of you guys find the real, quote unquote, real news? How do you gather news throughout your day? And what advice do you have, I'm sorry for rambling, what advice do you have for folks who are trying to cut through the noise and know that, okay, this is worth following, right? Because there's newspapers out there that are not really newspapers.
Yeah. I mean, when you mentioned, there was a thing in the old days called yellow journalism. I don't know if anybody's old. Okay, tabloids, Hearst came up with that, where you would sensationalize things, and this is what people, bread and circuses kind of thing. But there are some, across the world, there are certain papers that I read to try and get a picture of what's actually going on. And you can call them progressive, which I balk at, because apparently progressive means that they're people that deal in facts rather than try and do something else. So you've got The Guardian, you've got New York Times, you've got the LA Times, you've got papers around the world that when you go to them are trying to give you, this is the story, and then you'll go to the editorial page to find out what they're saying, but they're not going to mix the two things. And to give you an idea about, yes, I know this has always been going on. In 1982, there was the Falklands War. It was the first big war I covered. And I was in Buenos Aires, and my husband, man became my husband, and he was big up in BBC, and every day we would send a report out about what was happening. And he would report that the Argentinians are today saying they shot down 5 Sea Harriers. Then they shot down 10 Sea Harriers, and they shot down 2. Well, if you figured it out, there were only 12 Sea Harriers in the world, but they shot down 57 of them. So we would report this, that this is what they are saying. That's a fact. The Argentinian government is saying this. Margaret Thatcher was so angry at our reporting, she went to the House of Commons, stood up there and said the BBC News in Buenos Aires are traitors because they're being too objective. I'm 23 years old. Objectivity is one thing. Too objective, I can die and go to heaven and say, fine, I've done my job. And the problem is objectivity is no longer something you even hear about. It's the job, so if you know that there's a newspaper that everybody doesn't like, on both sides, that's the one you should be reading. That's where I take my cue from. If everybody is really angry at them, they're probably putting out facts rather than what people would like to hear, because just because you want to hear it doesn't mean you should.
Well, I would say that I have made a conscious choice to stop getting as much of my news and information as possible. This is going to sound crazy and like a curmudgeonly as hell, but not from digital sources.
Right.
And so that means I'm trying to read a lot more, and I'm trying to find books that cover waterfronts. I tell you, it's more time consuming, et cetera, but for me, and I try to read them in print so I'm not interrupted by emails or everything else, or, oh, look at that funny YouTube video. So that's one thing. The second thing I would say is that I put a lot more store in a documentary that people have worked on for 10 years now than I do in a lot of what passes for video news on 24-hour cable. When I see banner headlines on a website, I almost immediately say to myself, banner headlines, that used to be President Kennedy is shot.
Yeah.
Or it used to be something so huge, but you look at a lot of websites or news sites and they're banners. So if I go to a website and I see a banner headline every day, I know I'm not going there again. So I try to, if I'm going to look at any news sites, I try to look at places that are kind of balancing their graphics so that I'm not being steered in particular ways. More than anything else, I'm trying to be very conscious about everything I take in. I do also agree with you about those sites and places that I trust, but I'm just more conscious about everything I'm absorbing.
Check everything.
Yeah, I love the New York Times. I know I've contributed to them over the years, and I know that it's the most rigorous, most well-respected, and I just don't have time. I don't have time to sort out like where the angle's coming from and what all of that, but I am a lot on Twitter too, which I'm finding, I'm thinking your advice sounds like the wise thing right now, just for sanity purposes, just sort of sticking with the more long-term things, because I think the reason why there's so many banner headlines is because there's banner news like every minute, and it's like every second is, they're not hyperventilating, like really serious stuff is happening like every second. So, I really appreciate, the editors who can, because I just don't have time, just so they can curate the experience so I don't have to be chasing and questioning whether something is true or not. So, yeah, the Post, New York Times.
Very briefly, I have, for decades, I pay attention to the bylines. So we all share the same news sources, and I would add to that Washington Post, the New Yorker. I also have a very strong interest in what's going on globally. So I will watch Euronews and look at their headlines. I look at what Reuters is reporting, the wire services. Now you have to be very careful, because wire stories are often all the time. They're updated over and over again. The reason why they're still obviously valuable is that they actually have people on the ground in Juba. You're going to find out that there are other horrible things or wonderful things or innovative things that are happening in a lot of other countries. But Natalie, you brought up something that I really think is key. Once you know the reporters, once you've cited who those people are that you tend to read first every time you pick up a newspaper, follow them on Twitter. because what I have found invaluable information, and it's not necessarily about the big stories that are going on. Sometimes it's the smaller stories that they find interesting, and it will go to a local newspaper. One story that I found through, actually I'm embarrassed now because I can't remember who the reporter was, but there was a story that's going on now about how in Detroit there's a lawsuit. The Board of Education is being sued by 7 students, 7 Detroit area students, for the right to be able to read. Is that a constitutional right? Can you imagine? And I got that story by going through Twitter to see who was talking about things that weren't part of, the disastrous nature of what's going on in DC. And whatever else was, whatever else is the salacious thing that is always, the shiny, bright object. But that story haunts me because I'm not in a position right now to work on that story. But the idea that the Board of Education in Detroit is pushing back and saying it is not the constitutional right of children to be able to read. That should be screaming across every single newscast in the country, and it should be treated the same way we're treating Stormy Daniels, because this has tentacles that go far beyond Detroit. So there are things that, they're good and bad, but once you're accustomed to sort of making your opinion as to who you feel that you can trust and follow as far as journalism is concerned, you can follow them in a format that is democratic. There are still vestiges of that. And I think, I'll leave you with this, I think that the Parkland students, the students who survived such a horrible experience, they're reading things, and they're pointing your attention to a lot of different problems that we're not even covering. So I find it an interesting time, and I feel like maybe things aren't so bad.
I really like the conversation to focus on Twitter for a moment. That's how I get most of my news, and I do it exactly from the way you all suggested. Find the writer that you trust, find the outlet you trust, and follow that. Now, I think maybe I'm naive to think this, but perhaps not everyone is able to cut through the noise and say, oh, well, this website is not one that I should be following. Clearly, that isn't the case, because look at what happened with Facebook and all these different fake news. But I think if you use Twitter and you find those writers that you really value and realize that they know what they're doing, read the bylines, it'll direct you to many different things. So jumping off of that, we were talking before about the Parkland students, and they've really utilized Twitter and social media in a way where it has become the medium, right, and not just the message. It's not them, and here is a generation that is so often maligned for being stuck on their phone, Instagram, Twitter, talking about what they had for lunch, whatever it may be. Instead, now they've taken it and turned it into something that is life-changing and hopefully, will change the policy in this country. So could we talk a bit about that, and what are some I guess, Twitter tactics that you guys use in finding your news, and how it's affected the way you go about your reporting?
It's a democratic environment, but you have to, the audience, those of us who go on Twitter, we have a responsibility to keep it democratic. That means that you should also follow people who are disagreeing with what you feel and what you think you know. In addition to which, I used the Parkland students recently because of the push back against them, which is really interesting, because for the most part, the media has focused on the media has focused on the white students who have been fighting. Yes. And Move On started when? MoveOn.com started, was it during the early years of the Obama administration? I can't remember when it was. But Move On was talking about a lot of things, but talking around a lot of things, and I never got a sense of who was behind Move On. And then Black Lives Matter erupted, and the next thing you know, it's like COINTELPRO, it has resurrected. Edgar Hoover has, Edgar J. Hoover, J. Edgar Hoover, I'd like to forget he existed, has resurrected because there's a pushback against everybody who's part of Black Lives Matter, because there's a bastardization of what that cause is about, what the social conscious, issues that they're bringing up. So all of those kinds of things, you have to learn that you are responsible for educating yourself. We can give you the tools, but we can't be everywhere. We can't be the journalists who are always going to tell you at 7 o'clock every night, or whenever you watch television, if you watch television news. You have to do due diligence in making sure that you understand what else is going on, and to understand when you don't hear a voice, when you don't see the perp walk, know what's going on, because there's an awful lot that's taking place, because the bias is still, there's a bias still trying to stereotype everything. And I'm not just talking about racial issues, I'm also talking about, things that are dealing in politics, things that are dealing in community boards. There's a narrative that people are lazy and they don't continue to look underneath, the story. They just perpetuate the same thing that somebody else has said. And they even do it with syntax that makes no sense. Everything now is an existential threat. What? Everything is now transactional. Let's get to the low-hanging fruit, and it's the same stuff over and over again. My mother just said, "What does there mean?" What are they talking about? I'm an intelligent person. What is there? It's as if they're too lazy to explain to me what the real story is about and why I should care. So anyway, that's my 2 cents.
I'm going to come at it from a slightly different tact. Something, again, that I use Twitter, but I have a basic problem with digital media. No offense. I come from a world, I took a tortuous route as a journalist. My very first job, I was an assistant assignment editor in Philadelphia, in television news. My very first paying job. And my job was to sort of decide what some of the stories were for the day for 4 million people, which at the age of 18 was sort of bizarre, but okay. And people said, well, that's very elitist, and who is this person to decide for these things? So when the internet came along, everybody said, see, this is egalitarian. There is no filter. You're going to get your news, and you can decide what you want, what you can use from that, and what makes sense to you. And here's what's happened. So now you get all this stuff out there, and you get these amazing headlines like, oh my God, this person did that, and this thing happened there. I just can't even think of one. Even with Twitter, you have to check the facts. And that's why I keep coming back to facts. If you see a headline that completely outrages you, really you find completely outrageous, check it before you believe that it's a story that's real. I guarantee you, 99 times out of 100, that is not a real story. If you are so appalled by what you hear. Now, that being said, the other day there was a story that I was completely appalled about, and it was true. It was Louisiana State Senate saying 10 Republicans voted for bestiality. I mean, I don't understand that. But yeah, there was a vote taken to outlaw bestiality. Out of 35 people, 25 voted, to have this law, so bestiality was illegal, and 10, which all were the Republicans, voted against the law. And you're like, I thought for sure this has got to be fake. But that was actually real, and I was like floored. But I checked it. The point is, check it. I don't care if it's Twitter, I don't care if it's whatever you're looking at. You will find that stories that are so crazy, and people get really outraged. I can't believe they did that. Don't believe they did it, because chances are, it's not real. So if there's not an assignment anymore. Now, if you're following your journalists from New York Times or from the New Yorker or from the Rolling Stone, You can trust it because somebody's been going through and fact-checking and making sure, because those are respectable places. But you don't know where all this is coming from, so you have to be the assignment editor. You have to be the fact-checker to make sure that what you are accepting into your world as real is actually real, because we're not doing it anymore.
Okay, I was just going to say, I agree with it, but I just don't think that it's realistic. You know, like people, I mean, we're trained as journalists. This is what we do. You know, your average person doesn't have time to fact check everything that they're doing. So, you know, I think, you know, that's why it's not out of elitism. It's just simply, I don't have time. So once something becomes a trusted source, now there are people who I don't trust at the New York Times too.
Yeah,
You know,
yes,
so I don't,
you.
you know, I don't
That's
look
right.
at them. So, you know, I sort of use Twitter the same way. Like, you know, so I started by following some of the news sites, and then I saw who they were following, and then you find people who are like, oh, they really make good sense. But as soon as somebody sends me on some wild goose chase, like they're out. Like I'm out, I'm not following them anymore. And so that's how I've been able to do that. But I think, you know, right now with the Facebook issue, you know, I think that we do have to come to grips with, you know, back to this fairness doctrine that, you know, we started the conversation about. Like, we do have to come to grips with, like, the public needs some sort of guide. Like, there has to be some sort of arbiters of something. Like, we're in just crazy town, right? I mean, like, I think the time when I really was just like, oh my God, was this Pizzagate thing. You know, where this person actually comes in with a gun into a pizza shop in D.C. Because he believes that Hillary Clinton was running a crime ring, you know, and so he actually came in and
a
pedophile ring, right? So he comes in, you know, he travels. I think he came from North Carolina, and he came in you know, and he actually shot into this restaurant. Because he believed that this account that was online. And so, you know, at that point I was just like, oh my goodness, we have crossed some sort of crazy boundary, but that's not it. I mean, I think a lot of people are making their voting decisions based on, you know, some of these news that's being manipulated. So it does require a policy. Like, I don't think we can just say people fact check everything. Like, we actually have to take some collective action to make sure that we can make sure that we're talking about the same thing.
Just to answer your question about Twitter, I don't really use it that much. It's it's like everything. I want everything to slow down a bit for me these days. So I just try to. Twitter is it's too constant. So I'm just going to throw that out there. But for me, I'll tell you something. I hear what you're saying about the Pizzagate story. But for the last year, I spent almost the entire year working on one of the most famous true crime stories of the last 20 years. And it's a story that everybody generally believed was 100% true. It was not questioned. All the networks reported it. The New York Times, to its credit, kept it at arm's distance, but they generally followed the trend of their reporting, and that is the Scott Peterson case. Okay, most people believe the Scott Peterson case was really nailed perfectly from the beginning. It's very clear. He's a shady guy. His pregnant wife disappears. What's he doing? Fishing on Christmas Eve. Does anybody remember this story at all, the Scott Peterson case? You know, after when the verdict was announced, there was a crowd of hundreds of people cheering that verdict. In fact, you know, and to tell you this, I was working at 60 when that piece was reported, and I remember thinking, we're about to go to war in Iraq, and this country is obsessed with this West Coast case. What is going on? That's one of the first moments when I was wondering, what is media doing to our population, and what is our role in this? So as it turns out, as many of you may know, there was never any evidence of any kind that Scott Peterson killed his wife. There was never any DNA evidence. There was never any witnesses. There was never any confession, even though he had years for somebody to get some crumb out of him. There was always an alternative story. I didn't know, for instance, because it was barely reported by the national media, that on the morning she went missing, at 11 a.m., right around that time, there was a burglary across the street from the Peterson house. And there was evidence that was never presented in trial, that's very credible evidence that came from police sources, that in fact, Laci Peterson encountered the burglars, right? There was talk about that was picked up at a local prison. So all this stuff is now being adjudicated in the state of California. And was seen by the legal community in California and by the United States the population of this country, and it was at a moment before all this happened with our fractured media, I think is, at the very least, he got a terrible deal. The jury pool was tainted. That was a rotten case from the get-go. And yet I think most people who think about that case now think, well, there's at least a case where the good guy got. But in fact, I think there is a case where you see we have to be so careful about the narratives that we buy into. So while I agree with you, we can't expect everybody to be fact checkers, and I would argue even ourselves it's very hard to do that. But it's the larger narratives we have to constantly ask ourselves, what are we buying into? What are we letting our emotions get tapped into? How can we discipline ourselves a bit more to say, wait a second. And we're not going to get it right every time, and populations are going to make these mistakes, but I find it's an older problem than Twitter and Facebook.
Definitely, and if I could just add one other thing to that. I think part of it, and also something that you mentioned, the very first conversation was, the shift with CNN, and how it became this 24-hour and how that really changed it, and how news used to be a service. It was a public service that was done. And it's become more entertainment. So what I found during the election in November 2016, I was back on campus for the first time in a long time, and I was teaching a freshman mass media class, and we were covering the election. We talked about the election like every day in class, and the way that they talked about it was just like a reality TV show. Like they were very disconnected that this is like really like what's happening. And so I remember the morning after the election, like they still kind of were just kind of like, it was an 8 a.m. class, so maybe they were tired, but they were just still sort of like, and I'm like banging on the podium, like, wake up, call your parents, call your grandparents, figure out how they made it through, the 60s, like, get up. But they're so desensitized to it because it's not news, it's entertainment, and these are characters, and, people are just following stories, and it's fun, and, and it's like, it's a game, so
that was the Scott Peterson case. That was a great story. That was a Hollywood story. The scumbag husband, the blonde bombshell mistress, the missing wife. How could it not be true? It's such a great story. Well, guess what? Maybe it wasn't true. And sometimes great stories aren't true, even if you want them to be.
It's called never let the truth get in the way of a good story. And that's really what it's all about. I remember during the first Gulf War, the first Iraq War, and I was in Baghdad the whole time. Again, everybody thinks that only CNN was there. It's not true. They just the only ones that got the 4-wire because their illustrious reporter read a communique every day that we said, well, we'll look at it, but we're not going to read it if it's not news. Because there is when you first start seeing, propaganda by a major news organization being spouted by a government. Because my job is not to spout what a government says. My job is to figure out what's going on. But you have this 24-hour, and everybody thinks that CNN's coverage then was the best. And it's wonderful, and look at how honest they were, when actually they were just spouting everything Saddam wanted them to spout, which was really horrifying to me. But what got me was when I came back, and I was there, and then I went with Kurds in the mountains, so I was away for a very long time. I was away for a year and a half without coming home. When I came back, all people were talking about at one point was the Scud Stud. I don't even know who the reporter's name was.
Right.
It was an NBC reporter that sort of went, and I'm sitting there thinking, wait a minute, people were dying everywhere, and what I got from my own network was they wanted us to go to get help because we were so angry that the road to Basra was bombed, the retreating army was bombed, and as journalists, we knew there's certain laws of war you're not supposed to do, but everybody here was flying the flag, including my own network, CBS, was saying, our troops, it's like, no, that's, at one point I had a gun pointed at my head from Saddam Hussein because Connie Chung, we were doing a live show, a live report into the Sunday night show, and Connie Chung at that time was the reporter, the anchor, and she basically said something to the effect of, does Saddam still beat his wife? At which point, Uday Hussein was my minder, and he pulled a gun on me, and I fell to my knees, and he's like, you work for a very stupid network, and I went, mm-hmm. He said, no more live shots for you, and the cameraman and I went, thank you. It's like, we were not, but it's the kind of thing where you're sitting back here hearing about Scud Stud, and you're seeing things blown up, and you never saw the blood. You didn't see the burnt bodies that we saw when we bombed that bomb shelter, and you still won't see it because we're not going to show you what war looks like. Because if you see that, you might not like that, so we're not going to upset you. And the problem is, you're all sitting there and going, well, you know, I still think it is their responsibility to fact check, because if you don't like the way your world is going, then you need to, I mean, now we don't have these people out there anymore trying to figure out if there's not that many good guys out there right now that are putting out news, because there's so many places it's unfiltered. Unfiltered is not a good thing. So you have to start really filtering, because the bias has just gotten out of control.
Panel, could we talk a bit about the idea of the echo chamber? Because I think this all ties into that. How do we break free of our silos of our echo chamber?
I want to push back a little bit on that, and maybe it's a surprising way. There is an echo chamber in terms of, you know, we all say it to our friends and our family that we preach to the choir. We're living in a very unique time for us. Now, maybe there's a point in history where the same kinds of awfulness were going on in terms of somebody, you know, essentially trying to turn this country into a dictatorship. But this is an interesting conundrum that we all have. How does the press cover what's going on now in terms of the Trump administration? And, you know, there have been lots of articles and a lot of headbanging about it, but I think that there's been something that's missed in at the core of it. We're dealing with somebody who not only does not know what he is doing, but who thinks that he can turn this country into the organization that he has led very opaquely at the Trump Tower in New York City. There's no way to be objective about that, because it's wrong. Joyce and I are working on her documentary about climate change. This business about giving equal time to people who deny climate change, now I'm not talking about the political aspect, I'm talking about the people who think that the earth is only 6,000 years old. There is no fair time for that. That is not fact. That is not even in the realm of intelligence. We know what is going on in terms of evolution, science. People are relying on innovation to get rid of cancers. You can't have that going on and then say, well, no. You know, we have to teach creationism as fact in schools. So for the press to allow that to go on doesn't make sense. And I'd like to remind people of something that you may not know. Back in 1954, I think it was, Edward R. Murrow decided that he was going to go after the insanity of Joseph R. McCarthy and McCarthyism. HUAC, House Un-American Activities. Yeah, essentially calling everybody a communist. So he started going after people who were in the U.S. Army. And I mean, it was going on and on and on and on, and not to get into the weeds about it. But Edward R. Murrow and Fred Friendly at CBS News decided to sit down and to craft a story that called out the craziness of what this man was doing and the dangerous nature of what he was doing. Everybody who was involved with that broadcast knew that their jobs were on the line, because William Paley, who was the owner of CBS News, had essentially said, don't rock the boat too much. We're living in dangerous times. So this group of people, this group of journalists, decided that they were going to say, screw that, because this doesn't make sense. And instead of being objective journalists, they were subjective journalists, because they saw something that was wrong. We're not going to go down into the same kind of morass that Germany went into, where it allowed fascism, where Italy allowed fascism, where this country has allowed a form of fascism throughout our history, beginning with genocide, beginning with the enslavement of people. You can't forget that history. So for the press to come back and to say, well, we have to hold back and we have to be balanced and all of this kind of stuff, it's a nonsense because we can't allow that to go on. We can't allow people to say we're fake news because it doesn't fit the narrative of augmenting Trump to a monarchy or dictatorship. So we're stepping over that line. We're making sure that you hear it over and over and over again because you have to understand, whatever side you are on the political spectrum, this is wrong, and it doesn't serve anybody.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that, 'cause I was going to go down that road too. Just because, as I started talking, objectivity, many of us believe has been a myth really from the beginning. So people, you're not a machine that goes in the field and just collects information and, that's value free. There's nothing that's perfectly objective about it. But you can be fair in the way that you're covering it and try to tell larger truths. And so, the job of the journalist is to really try to immerse themselves in the story and learn as much as they can, and then do the best they can to try to tell the truth about what the situation is. But what has happened, and I think, Citizens United is a big important thing to think about when you're talking about the press and the free press and the information that we get too. They decided that money is speech. Right, so conservatives and very rich, wealthy interests, they have access to the bullhorn that everyday people don't have, and you really need more journalists, at least trying to even it up, so that there's not. So I had a thing on Twitter about this. There was this conservative education. So I write about education stuff a lot, or I have over the years since I've had kids.
Detroit.
Right. And this, prominent conservative writer who around education, who sort of promotes privatization of education systems, and I mean, he gets a lot of air all the time, and he's tweeting to the head of the Education Writers Association, some article about how terrible it was that they fired this conservative writer at the Atlantic, and they need to realize that they need to have conservatives in, and I'm just like, this is how this thing happened. Actually, this is how it happened with Facebook. The conservatives went to them and they start working the refs, right? And they say, oh, you can't control what we're putting on our feeds because, you're trying to bias us, right? And so they make it so they basically have a free reign there. And so they're, especially like around education reform, conservatives are controlling the entire narrative. So this idea that you have to you have to be fair, you have to be balanced and give them more of a platform, I just think is ridiculous. It's like there's truth and there isn't. I mean, there's peer-reviewed, scientific information that you can learn about, different dimensions of education reform, and then you have the stuff that those foundations fund. You have those reports that fund to sort of skew their agenda. And so I think the job of the journalist is really to try to be as fair and arbiter as possible. And just like, and you have to reject that equal time, like, oh, we have to give, since we have somebody who thinks that climate change is real, we have to bring on somebody who says climate change is not real. I mean, that's ridiculous.
But that's a corruption of the idea of objectivity to me was always an aspiration. The mistake or the corruption was that it was a reality. It's always an aspiration to me, and what is it that we're talking about when we talk about objectivity? We are essentially talking about the attempt to get all the relevant facts. Yes. But if one side in a supposed balanced argument is one that has no respect for facts, well then that's not part of the conversation anymore. So what I'd like to answer this question about the echo chamber, I actually attempted this a few years ago. My last book was a book called Reasons to Believe, and it was about my journey both into evangelical Christianity. I was a born-again Christian when I was 16, and then back out again in my early 20s. And around the time of the 2004 elections, I was living in Brooklyn. My wife is Jewish. My in-laws are Jewish. Most of my friends had no idea what evangelicals were, who they were, but I knew exactly who they were because many members of my family were in that world, and I had been through all that. And so I set about to write this book, and as part of that, what I did was I tried to go back to all the people I had known, and I wanted to talk to them about why they stayed in and why I got out. I wanted to use that personal journey to get at the state of evangelical Christianity at that time, about 10 years ago. So in the process of this, I made a documentary with my old college roommate who stayed in. And he said, well, if you want to ask me questions, I want to ask you questions, so let's just turn it into a documentary. So we did it, and we took it all over the country. And we took it to churches, and we took it to the New York Theater Workshop in the heart of Manhattan, where they never saw an evangelical in their lives. And then I went to Baylor University, and I spoke to students who the first 7 or 8 of them stood up, wanted to convert me, and were throwing conversion, stuff at me. We did this everywhere, and it was amazing what happened, because at that moment, and the echo chamber wasn't nearly what it is today, but it was there, it was very strongly there. So a lot of people would say, well, I never saw an atheist before, but just based on what I'm seeing now, I actually like the Christian better than the atheist, because he seems like less of an asshole. And then when we would go to evangelical circles, they would say, oh, actually, Craig, Craig Detweiler is my friend's name, you're kind of being, you're being pushy, you're being the ugly evangelical. I kind of like this atheist over here. And essentially what that did was it opened up this space for people to start talking about the complexity of faith or lack of faith, or what it means to have family members who think differently than you. You know, some people just want to stand up and say, I have a brother, I love him so much, but he believes this crazy stuff, how do I deal with that? So in that moment, I think we did, very briefly in our little way, smash open the echo chamber so we could all talk to each other, but it wasn't about us all agreeing that the other side was right. It was all about sort of taking a moment to say, okay, who are we actually? And are our lives the cartoon cutouts that we make of that we present to ourselves when they're not in the room, or are they more complex and rich and mysterious than we believe? And that doesn't mean giving any ground on the Trump question.
No.
It just means understanding that the weirdness of all this is we actually are all holders of American passports, right? We are all human beings. We are all born and we die, and there's all that stuff that goes with that. So if I think about how to do this now in this polarized atmosphere, I don't have any answers, but 10 years ago, it was possible to at least crack the door a little bit.
So panel, how do we change the mindset of mass media in terms of giving equal time to both sides? Because we see it all the time, and it's not, to me, I don't see it changing.
Equal time to both sides is a nonsense. You don't give equal time to irrationalities and say that it's equating to rational thought. You can't put rational thought where there's no logic. And the problem is we have an organization that since 1980-something or other has been saying it's fair and balanced. Well, fair and balanced is not what it's about. Pushing, I mean, if you're, look, there's a globalization of our media that has happened, especially recently. It's gotten out of, I mean, I now totally understand what happened to the media in World War II, in Nazi Germany before World War II. I'm seeing it happen every day. And the problem is we're misunderstanding objectivity and balance. Facts are facts that I can say to you. Now, if you're going to have, I mean, we used to have a fairness doctrine that was about actually elections mostly. Yeah. You had people that were running for office. You had to give each side equal time to put their case forward. That is not the same as giving equal time to, a non-fact-based thing against, okay, in my case, okay, so sea level is rising. It is rising now. This is happening. Well, does it matter anymore if it's man-made or not man-made? Actually, it doesn't. It's too late for that. But the fact of the matter is we have absolute proof that we have done this, and we have proof that we can make changes to it. Now, the other side was saying, well, we have our own ideas. That's not balanced. That's not fact to give the same amount of time and equal weight to that. It's only balanced if you have, okay, I like the color blue versus the color red. Then we can talk about that. But it's not true if you're saying that something that is completely irrational is the same as something that's rational thought. It's just not the same, and that's where we have to walk away from that. And I think the problem is that people are making a lot of money off keeping you confused, and it works.
I just want to pick up on something right off of that, because 3 of us spent years, decades, working at CBS News. I won't mention his name, but someone real high up said, Trump may be bad for the country, but he's great for our ratings. That gives you an idea of how the decision-making is being done. First of all, going back, and I'm going to push this until my last day, journalism is a public service. We are not supposed to be making loads and loads of money for the shareholders to sit around and not give the fair kind of treatment, which is another real part of journalism, not giving us a living wage. Having the shareholders, pour money into their pockets, and then you wind up with, forgive me, Katie Couric earning $65 million for, I have no idea why, pulling on the work of everybody else who was supporting her. She's not the one doing the research. She's not the one who's spending, 18 hours at the office trying to track down sources. This is a collaborative effort. And one of the great joys I had working with Mike Wallace was that when I first started working with him, he recruited me to 60 Minutes. And he said, let's get something straight right off the bat. You do not work for me. You work with me. And I thought to myself, wow, that's a wonderful kind of thing. Except no one else realized that whenever I was going out and doing these different stories. And Mike, to his credit, when he saw it for himself, always corrected everybody about that. And I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. Getting back to public service. I really lost my train of thought. I'm really sorry.
Actually,
about
one
that.
thing really
I'm
quick
gonna let you
about balance. I just want to make one thing clear. There's kind of a very basic way of talking about this question of balance. Like, there's no argument, but if you're saying democracy is a great form of government, counter argument, dictatorship is a great form of government. It's got to be, you got to clearly understand journalism, love of facts, use of facts to organize our thinking about things, that can only function in an open society. And so when journalists, this is what we do, this is what we come from. It's the same with scholars, it's the same with anybody whose attempt to get at real information, understand the truth. That can only happen in an open society. So if one other side of the argument is trying to argue that that form of society is wrong or false or should be somehow undermined because dictatorship or controlling, then there's not, so that's kind of one way of looking at this. I mean, if you want to value whatever it is that journalists do, then you have to understand that journalists are creatures who exist only in open societies. In a dictatorship, we are not journalists, we are propagandists.
There was something, actually it was something off of what John was saying in a roundabout way. This was where I was trying to go. There is a lot of money that's required to do very good journalism. And when you're involved with doing investigative journalism, which is what all of us really rely upon, we want to know whether or not our drinking water is safe. Because if you don't have that kind of journalism, you wind up with Flint, Michigan. If you want to know whether or not your kid is getting, the kind of education they need, then you need to dig deep, and you need to be able to stay on a story so that when people try to shift that narrative, you're able to follow what they're trying to do. And that requires a lot of money. And the excuse is, now that I think every single news outlet out there, except for the Times maybe, is owned by a corporation. And now what's happening, as I'm sure you've all heard, Sinclair is just putting out whatever kind of propaganda they want, calling it news, where all of the news anchors across pretty much the middle part of the country said exactly, it's read a script, and people were able to put together in unison the same script so that everyone was saying the same thing. That is what you need to be aware of, because that is nothing but propaganda. It's not journalism. And the sad thing about it is that people who disagree with it were threatened with their jobs. So they're taking away our ability to do investigative journalism. They're taking away our ability to have a beat so that we understand a school board or education or politics or the military or foreign news or what's going on in a given part of the United States that is rarely covered. Those are the kinds of things that we have to fight against, but that's a really big fight. That's a hard one because we don't have any purchase in the argument because we don't have the power to change it unless we collectively start saying, you need to stop this. You know, just like Black Lives Matter, we need a Black Lives Matter for journalism.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm afraid we're out of time, but thank you to Natalie, John, Joyce, Lori. Thank you very much.
Thank
It's a
you.
pleasure.